I have known a few men in my time who listened, truly listened, the way a man reads a deed of property, word by word, missing nothing. Fletcher Hawn was one of them, and the afternoon he met Adelaide Proctor at the livery stable fence in Harlan, Montana, he happened to be in exactly the right place to prove it. Adelaide Proctor was 34 years old, and she ran the town's lending library out of 2 rooms attached to the back of the hardware store. She had brown eyes that noticed things, a way of speaking that left no useful word out, and a reputation in Harlan that had preceded her into every conversation she'd had with an eligible man for the past 6 years. She knew this about herself the way a farmer knows the shape of his land. Not with bitterness, exactly, but with the particular clarity that comes from having mapped the same territory too many times. Fletcher Hawn was 41, a stonemason who had come to Harlan the previous autumn to lay the foundation for the new courthouse. He had a quiet that wasn't unfriendly, hands that looked like they'd been built for the work they did, and a habit of saying less than he knew, which in Harlan, where many men said considerably more than they knew, was unusual enough to be noticed. He had first noticed Adelaide at a church social, where she was arguing patiently with the county assessor about a surveying error that had miscalculated the tax on 3 homesteads along the river. The assessor had not enjoyed the conversation. Fletcher, watching from across the room with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, had found himself considerably more interested in her than in the pie. When he asked to walk with her after the library closed on a Tuesday in late September, she stopped walking entirely, turned to face him, and said what she had learned to say early, before a man could invest time and then feel cheated when he found out later from someone else. She said, "Mr. Hawn, I ought to tell you something before you decide whether this walk is worth your while. 7 men in this town have declined to court me, and most of them gave reasons. I would rather you heard the reasons from me directly than have you learn them secondhand and spend time wondering what is wrong with me." Fletcher looked at her for a moment, then he said, "All right, tell me the reasons." She had expected surprise, or the particular brand of forced gallantry that usually preceded a man's eventual arrival at the same conclusion as everyone else. She had not expected simple direct interest. She said, "You may find yourself agreeing with some of them." He said, "I may, but I'd like to hear them first." To understand why Adelaide Proctor kept such a precise accounting of her own rejections, you have to understand something about what it meant to grow up the daughter of Harlan's first librarian, a man named Bernard Proctor, who believed, with a conviction that sometimes made him difficult at dinner parties, that a well-read woman was a better neighbor than an agreeable one. Bernard had raised his only daughter on the same principle he applied to his library: that things of value were worth cataloging carefully, and that a careful catalog told you more about what you had than any vague general impression ever could. Adelaide had read everything in that library before she was 22. She had developed opinions on territorial law, crop rotation, the reliability of the Northern Pacific's freight schedules, and the structural weaknesses of the county's new dam project. She had also, by the time she was 28, accumulated 7 separate men who had each, in their own way, determined that these qualities made her a poor candidate for a wife. She had begun keeping the list not to punish herself with it, but because a precise record was more useful than a vague ache. If she knew exactly what each man had objected to, she knew exactly what she was dealing with. And knowing what you were dealing with, her father had always said, was the beginning of being able to do something about it. Fletcher Hawn's understanding of women who were considered too much came not from philosophy but from a more personal place. He had grown up in Eastern Oregon, the nephew of a schoolteacher named Harriet Hawn, who had run the only school in her county for 23 years and was, by every measure Fletcher could apply, the sharpest person he had known in his life. She knew Latin and surveying and could calculate a roof's load-bearing requirements faster than the town's only engineer. She had never married, not for lack of interest on her part, but because the men who'd expressed interest had, one after another, eventually found her competence uncomfortable in the way that a man finds a mirror uncomfortable when the reflection is less flattering than he'd hoped. When Harriet died at 61, the county had hired a man of 26 to replace her. The man was affable, well-liked, and had, within a year, reduced the school's enrollment by 1/3 through simple incompetence. Fletcher had watched that happen from a distance, and the particular anger it had produced in him had never fully settled. When he heard Harlan talk about Adelaide Proctor, too opinionated, too educated, too plain-spoken, no man could manage her. He heard his aunt described in different words, and he had begun without quite meaning to pay attention. They walked the long way around the block, past the feed barn and back toward the library, and Adelaide told him the first name. Duncan Pratt was a wheat farmer who had courted her for nearly 2 months before withdrawal. After a Sunday dinner at his family's home, during which Adelaide had offered a corrective opinion about a territorial grazing bill that Duncan's father had mischaracterized, she said, He told me afterward that a farmer's wife needed to know when to hold her tongue in company, and that I had embarrassed him in front of his family by knowing more about the bill than his father did. Fletcher said, I know Duncan Pratt's operation. His father's been managing that land for 40 years and hasn't rotated a field in 15. The reason the yield's been dropping isn't weather, it's soil. I laid stone for their barn extension 2 summers ago and spent a week watching them make the same mistake over and over and refuse every suggestion. He paused. Duncan's objection wasn't that you knew too much, Miss Proctor. It was that you knew the kind of thing that, if you'd kept knowing it out loud, would eventually have required him to admit his father was wrong. Adelaide said nothing for a moment. She had heard people offer sympathy about her rejections before. She had not heard anyone examine them quite this way. The second name was Owen Selby, who ran the dry goods store and had courted her for 6 weeks before ending the courtship, after discovering that Adelaide kept a personal ledger of her household accounts that was, by his own admission, after examining it briefly at her invitation, more clearly organized than his own store's books. Fletcher said, Owen Selby's wife does his books now. Did you know that? He married a woman from Billings who turned out to be good with numbers, and he spends a fair amount of time making sure nobody in town knows it's her work and not his. I suspect your ledger didn't frighten him because it was better than his. It frightened him because he could already see exactly what his life would look like if he married a woman who noticed when the numbers didn't add up. The third name was Bertram Luce, a rancher's son who had never formally courted Adelaide, but had made his opinion of her prospects known clearly enough at a Grange meeting that it had become part of the general town understanding of her situation, declaring that a woman who spent her evenings reading instead of visiting was, in his words, unnatural, and would make a cold and useless wife. Fletcher said, Bertram Luce spent 3 years trying to get his cattle operation to turn a profit and couldn't manage it. He sold to a company buyer last spring, at a loss his own brother-in-law was embarrassed to mention in public. A man who has failed consistently at something straightforward tends to develop a particular resentment toward people who succeed at things he doesn't understand. Reading is something Bertram never learned to do well. Calling it unnatural was considerably easier than admitting that. The fourth name was Calvin Morse, and here Adelaide's voice shifted very slightly. Not softer exactly, but carrying a different weight. Calvin had courted her for nearly 4 months, which was the longest of any name on her list, and had, by every indication she could read, been genuinely interested in her. He had asked real questions about the books she recommended. He had come to the library on 2 separate occasions, simply to sit and read while she worked, which she had found more companionable than most men's most deliberate efforts at charm. He had ended the courtship 6 weeks before she'd expected it, telling her that his father had made clear he would reduce Calvin's inheritance considerably if he married a woman the Morse family considered inappropriate, and that Calvin had, after a long consideration, decided he could not afford to disregard his father's wishes. Fletcher walked a few steps in silence after this one. He said finally, I'm not going to tell you Calvin Morse was wrong exactly. A man caught between his family's money and his own judgment is in a harder place than most people like to admit. What I will say is that he made the smaller choice. I understand how that happens. I don't think less of him for being afraid. He looked at her steadily. But I think he'll spend a considerable number of years aware of exactly what he traded away, and that is its own kind of accounting. Adelaide said, That is the first time anyone has said anything that fair about Calvin in my hearing. Every other person either blamed him completely or excused him completely. Fletcher said, People who've never been in a hard choice usually have strong opinions about hard choices. I try not to be careless about them. The fifth and sixth names she gave together, since their complaints had been nearly identical. Pierce Farrow and Ned Coyle had each taken an interest in her at different points within the same year, and both had withdrawn after Adelaide had, on separate public occasions, corrected factual errors the men had stated with considerable confidence. Pierce about the distance between Harlan and the railhead, which he had given incorrectly at a town meeting. Ned about the terms of a water rights agreement, which he had misread in a way that would have cost 3 families along the creek, if the error had gone unchallenged. Fletcher said, Pierce Farrow has repeated that wrong distance 3 more times since you corrected him. He knows now that it's wrong and says it anyway, which tells you something about why he was angry. Ned's situation I know less well, but a man who states a thing incorrectly in public and then resents the correction more than the error, that man's problem is not with the person who corrected him, it's with the possibility of being seen to need correction at all. He shook his head slightly. Neither of them was angry that you knew the right answer, Miss Proctor. They were angry that you said it where other people could hear. They had reached the library door and Adelaide did not open it. She said, There is one more name. The 7th name was Randolph Ames, and it was different in kind from all the others. Randolph was a timber buyer who worked a circuit through several territories, and had first written to Adelaide in response to a letter she'd published in the territorial paper, a piece about the county library's need for expanded funding. He had been well-read, articulate, and genuinely interesting to correspond with, and for 11 months they had exchanged letters with a regularity and depth that had seemed, to Adelaide, to be building towards something real. When Randolph finally came to Harlan in person, he had been pleasant and familiar in the way of a man who'd said many things he meant. He had also, over the course of 3 days, let fall enough details that Adelaide had eventually understood, with a clarity that arrived slowly and then all at once, that he had been corresponding simultaneously with at least 2 other women in other towns, using, as she later discovered through a mutual acquaintance, letters so nearly identical they might have been copied out. He had been waiting to see which woman would prove most accommodating. Adelaide, who had written back as herself in every letter, had apparently not been accommodating enough to place first. Fletcher's expression changed when she told him this. It went still and hard, in a way none of the previous 6 names had produced. He said, "That is not a rejection from your list, Miss Proctor. That is a man who used 11 months of your attention as raw material for an experiment he never told you he was running." He was quiet for a moment, every name before his. "Whatever I think of those men, they at least left honestly. He stayed in his way and lied the entire time. I find I am considerably angrier on your behalf about that one, than about anything else you've told me this evening." Adelaide said quietly, "It was the one that took the longest to put down. The others I could examine and argue with and eventually understand, even the ones I disagreed with. Randolph never gave me a reason that was true, and a wrong reason you can examine is easier to carry than a lie dressed as something real." They stood at the library door in the cooling evening air, and Fletcher Hawn said, "I've now heard all 7, and I want to tell you what I actually heard." He said, "Duncan feared you'd notice his father's mistakes. Owen feared you'd notice his own. Bertram called you unnatural because reading was something he'd failed at and never admitted. Calvin was more afraid of his father's money than he was certain of his own judgment, and I hold that one differently from the rest. But it is still fear. Pierce and Ned wanted to be right in public more than they wanted an honest answer, and Randolph was never looking at you at all. He was looking for a mirror that would show him what he wanted to see, and you kept showing him something truer instead." He looked at her and said, 7 names. Not one of them says a single true thing about you. Every one of them says something true about the man who gave it." Adelaide Proctor stood at the door of the library she had run for 9 years, in the town where 7 men had delivered their verdict on her worth, and found that she did not have an immediate answer for a man who had spent an evening turning 7 wounds over and showing her the other side of each one. She said, after a moment, "Why did you ask to walk with me tonight, Mr. Hawn? You must have heard some version of this before you asked." He said, "I heard the version the town tells. I wanted to hear yours." He paused. "My aunt was the finest educated person in her county. She spent 23 years teaching children who grew up and hired a worse man to replace her, and the town never once said plainly that that was a loss. I spent a long time being angry about it, and then I started paying attention to where the same mistake was being made right in front of me." He looked at her. "When I heard how Harlan talked about you, I heard my aunt described in a different town. I wanted to know whether Harlan was making the same error." She said, "And now that you've heard the full accounting." He said, "Harlan is making the same error." He said it the way he said most things, simply, without any performance of feeling. "And I would like, if you're willing, to court you properly. With the full knowledge of everything 7 men decided was too much. I don't find it too much. I find it exactly what I would have been looking for, if I'd had the sense to look sooner." Adelaide said, "I'll accept that, Mr. Hawn, but I keep records. If you prove to be an 8th entry in the ledger, I will examine your particular failing with the same care you've just applied to the other 7. He said, "That seems entirely right. I would expect nothing less from a woman who keeps her accounts as well as you do." Fletcher Hawn and Adelaide Proctor were married the following spring, in a ceremony that drew a smaller crowd than the town's curiosity about them might have suggested. Though curiosity did account for a fair portion of the guests who came, a good number of Harlan had spent enough time deciding Adelaide was unmarriageable, that Fletcher's evident seriousness had struck many of them as either admirable or misguided, depending on how firmly they'd committed to the original conclusion. Adelaide kept the library and continued writing occasional pieces for the territorial paper. Fletcher finished the courthouse and took a contract on the schoolhouse edition, and stayed. In the years that followed, the ledger sheet want of rejections changed in character entirely, no longer a catalogue of wounds examined and re-examined, but a private record of small particular moments worth holding on to. Arguments conducted fairly. Opinions offered and considered rather than dismissed. A marriage built, year by year, without an 8th entry. Of the 7 men on her original list, 2 eventually said something to her that amounted to an acknowledgement, if not an apology in so many words. Duncan Pratt stopped her at the general store 7 years later, and told her without quite meeting her eyes, that his father's land had been sold to a company buyer the previous year at a considerable loss, and that he had spent some time thinking about choices he'd made and hadn't made. He didn't say more than that. Adelaide thanked him for telling her, and meant it. Owen Selby's wife, the woman from Billings who did the store's books, became over those same years something close to a friend, the kind of friendship that grows quietly between two women who understand each other's situation, without needing to discuss it directly. Owen himself never said anything to Adelaide, but she noticed that he stopped looking past her at civic gatherings and began, occasionally, to meet her eyes when she spoke. Randolph Ames she heard about only once, through a letter from the mutual acquaintance, who had first told her about his other correspondence. The letter said he had married, and that the marriage had ended badly, and that the woman who'd left him had cited a husband, who was never quite present even when he was in the room. Adelaide read the letter once, set it down, and did not take any particular satisfaction in it. Only the quiet, settled recognition that some patterns announce themselves eventually to whoever is paying attention. I have thought about Adelaide Proctor's list more than once since I first heard this story. What strikes me every time is not the list itself. It is what the list was actually measuring. 7 men, 7 rejections, and every single one of them, examined carefully, the way Adelaide examined everything, turns out to be a record of a fear. Fear of being outpaced. Fear of being corrected. Fear of a woman who would look at the numbers and tell you plainly what they said. A list of refusals can tell you a great deal about the people doing the refusing. You only need someone willing to read it the right way around. Tell me in the comments, of the 7 men who turned Adelaide away, which one do you think was the most honest about what he was actually afraid of?